Hi everyone, my name is Kennedy Casey and I'm a lab manager working with Marisa Casillas at the University of Chicago. And today I'm excited to share some of the highlights from an ongoing project in our lab. This project is in collaboration with Alika Bergelson and several fantastic research assistants. And together we have annotated well over 100,000 images captured from children's daily lives across multiple cultural contexts. And from the outset, I want to acknowledge the full team of people who have made this project possible. Broadly, in this project, we are interested in exploring children's everyday at-home experiences and how those may vary both across age and across different cultural contexts. As an initial way into the rich and multidimensional space of everyday life, our current focus for this project is children's own object handling. We're zooming into the moments of child object handling, with our goals being to quantify how often object handling happens and what types of objects are typically handled. This project includes a cross-cultural comparison of 3 different communities, with corpora collected by Marisa Casillas and Alika Bergelson. But for today's presentation, I'm going to focus just on our day-long object handling data from 2 small-scale subsistence farming communities located on opposite sides of the globe, one Seltal Mayan and one Russell Papuan. But first, why object handling? Children's first-person object handling experience affords them opportunities to learn many different dimensions of information, including objects' perceptual properties, their typical functions, which categories they belong to, and how they can be talked about. Object handling behavior is also something that we expect to change with age, as children become increasingly able to seek out, reach, and manipulate objects, and as children are often allowed to access a greater diversity of objects. Additionally, we expect object handling patterns to vary across cultures. Aspects of children's physical and social environments likely shape the specific types of objects that they have access to, and perhaps also how often they engage in object-centric interactions in general. Our goals for the current project are to broaden the narrow set of cultural contexts studied in the realm of object handling, and to expand the range of hours and locations sampled. Much of what we know about children's object handling behaviors come from very short in-lab studies or longer but not yet day-long recordings taken in children's homes, mostly in the United States. Thus, we do not know how well estimates of the frequency of object handling, around 60% of infants' time, for instance, or the widely demonstrated zip-like distribution across object types in shorter form American recordings, scale to a day-long time span, or generalize to children's experience across different cultural contexts. Here again, we're exploring day-long object handling in 2 distinct cultural contexts. The Seltal Mayan and Russell Papuan communities are similar in that they're both small-scale, rural Swidden horticulturalist societies, but they also differ in several key ways, including their current level of market integration, their child caring practices and day-to-day activities, and these differences may shape the patterns of object handling that we see in our study. So in order to capture day-long object handling behaviors, we have children wear a clip camera on their chest, which snaps photos a few times per minute. Here are just a few examples of object handling for one Seltal Mayan toddler, just to give you an idea of what our raw data look like. In total, we have 81 photo streams from children up to age 4, with about a 50-50 split between communities. Each stream spans 8 to 9 hours, and with photos captured 2 to 4 times per minute, that gives us just over 111,000 photos that have now been manually annotated in multiple passes. In this project, we first ask how frequent is child object handling, both between communities and across age, and then we explore the common targets of child object handling and other distributional patterns of object-centric interaction. To estimate the frequency of child object handling across the day, we specifically focus on the photos where children's hands are visible and ask how often their hands are occupied versus free. Here on the x-axis, we're plotting age in months, with the percentage of photos with object handling on the y-axis. And we see a significant increase in object handling time with age, and no differences between the 2 cultural contexts. On average, across the day and cultural context, or across age and cultural context, we find that children spend just under 1/3 of their day handling objects. This estimate is substantially lower than some recent estimates from 2-hour at-home recordings with 13 to 24-month-olds in the US, which these estimates are closer to 60% on average. But we cannot yet determine whether this reflects true cross-cultural variation, methodological differences, or some combination of the 2. But either way, we find here that object handling still captures a sizable proportion of children's everyday experience across cultures. And as we move toward thinking about what children may be able to learn from these relatively frequent object-centric interactions, the next step is to explore the targets of object handling. And here we do this at multiple levels of representation, including the category level, object type level, object token level, while also testing for effects of cultural context and age. For study 2, we focus only on the photos that were already identified as containing child object handling in study 1. And our definitions for the different levels of representation are as follows. Categories refer to groups of functionally related objects. We predefined 13 categories before annotation, modeling after some prior work and some of the research team's informal observations from visiting these communities. But we've since collapsed to these 8 most frequent categories for our analyses, including mealtime tools, consumables, work tools, toys, clothing, immovable objects like furniture and housing structures, natural objects, and miscellaneous synthetic objects. And for the remaining levels of representation, I'll just focus on mealtime tools as an example. So this category includes bowls, forks, spoons, plates, and any other mealtime tools you can think of. Object types refer to any exemplar of a specific type of object, so any bowl, for instance. And object tokens refer to specific instances of a given object type, and these are defined at the individual child level. For instance, we would mark bowl 1, 2, 3, and so on. Additionally, we coded for whether each token was specifically designed for children, and I won't focus on this in the main talk, but you can ask me during the Q&A. Now I'm just going to gloss over a lot of the details and give you some of the highlights of the current work to date, and include just one finding from each level of representation. First, at the category level, we find that the prevalence of object categories was largely stable over age and across cultural contexts. So on the y-axis here, we have the object categories, and x-axis, and the y-axis is the percentage of photos with object handling for each category. We see that consumables and synthetic objects were the most frequently handled by both Celtal and Russell children, and the distribution of handled objects was strikingly stable both across age and across our 2 different communities. We might expect this distribution to look different when we sample in other, more different communities, but for now we're seeing pretty striking similarity between the Celtal and Russell context. Next, we found that the distribution of object types was right-skewed, both at the community level and at the individual child level, mirroring patterns that other researchers have found for US children's object handling and other features of children's input, like the frequency of specific word types. At the community level, some objects like sticks, leaves, buckets, and bowls are handled by many children in each community, topping out at around 65%, but there's a quick drop-off. So the majority of objects, or 50 to 60% of objects, were only handled by 1 to 2 children in each community. We also see a right-skewed distribution at the individual child level. That is, each child spent a disproportionate amount of their time handling a small group of objects, and the rest of their time briefly interacting with all of the other objects throughout their day. It's worth noting that these top objects were quite rarely the same across children, pointing to significant individual variation, even when the overall profile of object handling might look similar. Finally, at the token level, we begin to see more cross-community differences. On the x-axis again, we have the same object categories, and on the y-axis, we now have unique object tokens per hour. So each point here corresponds to the average for an individual child throughout their day, and we see that Celtal children handle more unique object tokens from the synthetic and toy categories than Russell children, and we attribute this difference to the greater availability of synthetic objects and manufactured toys in the Celtal community due to their greater level of market integration. And next, we see more handling of immovable objects for Russell children, and this finding is consistent with descriptions of the lifestyle on Russell Island, where community members spend large portions of their day socializing on and around verandas under their households. So these tokens include the doors, stairs, and posts attached to verandas. So those are just some of the highlights of our work to date, where we see evidence for both kernels of similarity or shared types of experience between children growing up in diverse communities, as well as substantial individual, cultural, and age-related variation. Thus, a more general takeaway from this set of findings that I presented today, along with many others that were cut for time, is that different measures of object handling seem to reveal different aspects of children's worlds, including both stable and variable properties of everyday experience. We saw that the distribution of object categories and the overall skewed distribution of object types was largely stable across the first 4 years and persisted in 2 distinct cultural contexts. Thus, these overall patterns may reveal more stable properties of children's early experience that are robust to at least some variation across age and cultural context. And aside from the overall age-related increase in handling that we saw in study 1, other age-related changes and cross-cultural variation emerged only when we looked at finer-grained levels of representation, including the unique number of unique object types and tokens. And critically, the point I want to make here is that the dependent variables that we choose to measure matter in terms of whether we see stable or variable properties across cultures and age. And additionally, I want to make the point that the rate at which and the context in which we sample children's experience matter. Just to give you a sense of this, I'll show you box plots for individual children, where each point represents a specific hour in that participant's recording. And you can see here a pretty striking amount of even intra-individual variation. This means that if we use shorter recordings, we could get very different estimates of the frequency and targets of object handling, depending on the exact window of time that we sample. Thus, existing estimates from shorter recordings that typically take place during toy play or mealtime, for example, may not generalize to children's average experience across the day. But to summarize, for our current work, knowing the identities of the objects that children handle is just the first step in determining what they may be able to learn from these relatively frequent egocentric object interactions. These initial relatively coarse descriptions of children's object-centric input can motivate us to look even further at aspects of both consistency and variability in children's everyday experience. And importantly, seeing the world through a young child's point of view can generate many new questions for us about what they might be able to learn from. So I'll end with a plug for naturalistic descriptive research and thank once again our research team for their many contributions to this project, and especially the participants and their families for sharing their daily lives with us. And thank you all for listening.